You might need to shut that door. Did everybody put their license plate in the kiosk out here?
Yes.
If you did not, I don't see anybody who hasn't. You need to do that or you'll get ticketed. And as Dr. Onsman has learned in the past, sometimes you will get ticketed regardless of whether you put it in there or not. So I often take, we take a photograph of the screen saying you owe $0.
We'll be your witness.
Yes, if you need witnesses, we'll all show up in court for you.
Yeah.
Okay, there are papers on the end here with pens. If you don't yet receive emails and would like to, you may put your email address on there. As Harry would always say, make sure it's legible. That's why I put in parentheses legible, so that Harry takes care of the constant contact email list. Also, these little cups, very fancy cups here, are for contributions if you wish to make any. We do have some expenses, so we very much appreciate any contributions you would wish to make. Our purpose is to gather together in a setting where challenging and complex current cultural and religious faith issues are presented and discussed. We are not here to judge, but rather to create a safe space for significant conversation. Please be respectful of others and the views that they express. There will be a presentation. However, Rabbi decides to do it. We'd had a conversation around the table on whether or not I'll leave it up to him. And we'll have time for questions and comments, whether it be during the presentation or afterward. We'll figure that out. Although we want to encourage good discussion, please don't dominate the conversation to a point where others are unable to share their thoughts. We got people trying to come in still. You're going to lay it or lose. Normally we would have you raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you, and you can raise your question or make your comment. We believe that if we can hold to this format, everyone will leave here tonight enriched. Once again, you're late! Okay. I said that with love. We'd like to thank the Doubletree for this venue. It's a wonderful gift they give us for free, and we're very grateful to them. As I've said before, this was ranked the #1 Hilton brand hotel in the world. So we are, yes, if you didn't know that. I don't know if that still holds true, but it was ranked the #1. So now I would like to introduce our technological wizard. Who thinks he has powers that he doesn't. The Reverend, I know he tries to do that all the time. The Reverend Dr. Steve Hudson. He's tired of it. He should have got 2 doctors.
I know, it's my fault. It's my fault. Hi there, I'm so glad you're here. We're really excited to have Rabbi Brian with us. I went to my church just about a year after you went to the Temple of Shalom. I've had a really nice relationship with the congregation. One of the things I say is that even though, the Berks County area is not known for its trend setting, we know it's Pennsylvania Dutch thing. It's kind of, you take your time and you're very, careful about things. But one of the things in which we are way ahead of most of the world, at least in my experience, is how we deal with each other and trust each other in interfaith settings. I've never been anywhere where Muslims, Jews, and mainline Christians work together and respect each other so well. And it's just a beautiful thing to be a part of that. I know some of us, for example, at 9/11, we just called and went and collared up and stood outside of the mosque to make sure that they were safe. Whenever something happened within to Jews around the world, wherever it was, we always checked in. And a big reason why that is the case is because of Brian and his congregation. and the way that they are so respectful of us, and in turn we are respectful of them. So it is a gift that keeps on giving, and we are so appreciative of him and the work of the whole congregation, and looking forward to hearing what he has to say. So, Rabbi Michaelson.
So I know, wow, that's loud. I know they went through some basic background or rules of engagement, I guess would be the word. But I had a couple of my own, just to give you some background as well. First of all, I'm speaking for myself, right? I will not attempt to speak for the entirety of the Jewish people, right? There is an old joke that says you get three Jews in a room, you get 5 opinions. It's true. So I will share some facts with you about what is going on in our world today. But when it comes to some of the opinions, I will share mine. Okay? So that you don't hold everybody accountable for what I think or I believe. The other is sometimes in some of this conversation, Hebrew is my second language, and so sometimes I don't hear myself using a Hebrew word. So if I don't stop and explain it, tell me, so I can explain it. Other part of it is I've been speaking to groups for, I've been in town now 27 years, so I've been speaking for 27 years to various groups, and I have been asked every question I could possibly imagine, and a few that I couldn't imagine. And my rule is I never get upset by any question that somebody asks, right? So please feel free to ask it. Better that you ask the question than you worry about whether you're going to hurt my feelings, right? In return for that, what I ask is I may change your question to make sure that it's the right question to ask somebody who's Jewish, right? Because sometimes when we ask questions, we don't necessarily realize our bias may be, and I don't mean bias in a negative way, but our bias is even built into the way we ask a question. So I may restructure your question if it's appropriate. So I ask that you don't get mad at me. Does that sound fair? Mm-hmm. I want to share some facts about what life is like in the Jewish community right now. But I don't want to be all doom and gloom, and I'm also hoping that we'll have the opportunity to have some, this is still really loud. I'm going to be wearing it on my shoes. My congregation knows that I'm not a quiet person. So I want to start by telling you 2 stories and ask you a question. But I'll tell you the 2 stories first. I was in West Reading at Bold Cafe, and I had gone in to get myself a cup of coffee, and a gentleman who looked like he might have been sleeping on the street walked into the main area there, assuming he was going to get something for himself, saw me standing there and yelled at, "Hey, Jew boy." Now, despite the fact that I hadn't had my first cup of coffee yet, I was smart and fast enough to be able to turn around to him and look and say, "Excuse me, that's Rabbi Jew boy to you." Was that anti-Semitism? Yes. Okay. I was in Aldi's shopping. A man comes up to me and says, "You're Jewish, right?" "Yes." He says, "I'm really sorry about what's going on in your country." I look back at him a little confused and say, "What do you mean?" "Well, you know, in Israel." And I look back at him and I say, "But I'm a U.S. citizen. I was born here. My family lives here. I pay taxes here. Israel is an important place to me, but I'm an American. He says, yeah, but you know what I mean. Is that anti-Semitism? You said, you were shaking your head, ma'am. You don't think so?
No.
Good morning. But that's one of the really interesting questions that we sometimes have to face in today's world. Is that necessarily anti-Semitism? Right? The answer is, according to most international definition, the big international definition, it technically would be. Part of it was not because of the way it was said, but because of one of the tropes that was underneath the question as a whole, right? The trope underneath was that Jews are disloyal to whatever nation they live in. They're only loyal to each other and to the state of Israel. Because when I looked at him and said, but this is my country, his response was, but you know what I mean. And I did, and I was trying not to take offense. But at the same time, when you're in the middle of the supermarket, you don't necessarily want to get cornered with something like that.
Right.
So what is going on in our world, especially as Jews in this particular moment in time? If I started off by asking you the question, what percentage of the population of the United States is Jewish? Give me a percent. How large is the Jewish community? 2%? 5%? 15%? Do I hear 20? Less than one. Right? Answer to the question is, in the United States, according to the last Pew survey, Jews make up about 2.5% of the American population. So I often find it interesting that we talk about that this is a Judeo-Christian country, and it's Judeo-Christian, right? We get included in there, but we're a really small minority. Yet the really scary thing is that that makes up about 7.5 million people. By the way, as part of the world population, we are about 0.2% of the world population. We are a tiny, tiny minority. That makes it really interesting to sit here and say, if we look back at some of the data, and some of the most recent data we have is already a little outdated because it's 2023 is the last count we have. In the United States, there were 8,800 anti-Semitic incidences reported to the Anti-Defamation League. That means that somebody took the time to call or go online and file a form to say that this such and such had happened. As an example, my synagogue was the victim of three bomb scares. Only once did I bother to report it, because taking the extra time to fill out the extras, who wants to do that, right? So we can think that there are 8,800 in 2023 that were reported. How many went unreported, right? For 2.4% of the population, right? Last year there was a study that was done that says 77% of American Jews feel less safe in this country since the attack on October 7th, 2023. Right? What has that done? Well, I can talk personally in my synagogue. I'm now required to have an armed guard at every service, right? You can only be, the doors to our building are not open at all times, welcoming people to come in. You need to buzz in, stand in front of the camera to make sure that you can be identified and explain why you're there. Right. There are panic buttons spread throughout the building. So in case something happens, we're never too far away from a phone or a panic button. You walk into our sanctuary, and are only if you're looking for them will you notice bleed kits, right? For traumatic bleeding injuries. Because if a gunman comes in to shoot, you need to make sure you know where the tourniquet is to hopefully save somebody's life. I've had to take the severe bleed, the trauma training twice, right? Along with the regular stuff that you expect us to take. Right? The way I kind of describe it is, this isn't the job that I signed up for. When I started as a rabbi over 30 years ago, becoming a rabbi was not supposed to be a dangerous profession. Now as I walk into the building, especially when we're getting ready for a service, the thought still crosses my mind: is this going to be the day? Is this going to be the day that something happens? Right? We're not talking about some place far away. We're not talking about people we don't know. I'm talking about, this is the conversation I'm having in my own head. Right? So to say 77% of American Jews feel less safe, with all of that happening, you can imagine why. Right? Nearly 6 in 10 American Jews have said they have altered their behavior as a result of the attacks on October 7th and the rise of anti-Semitism in this country. I know you can go to some of these Facebook pages and people are saying, make sure you hide your Jewish star. Don't wear the yarmulke out in public, wear a hat instead. Because people are afraid. Right? 6 in 10, 60%. It's an amazing thing. 90% of American Jews say anti-Semitism has increased. I think is one that we can all understand. And 1/3 of American Jews can directly report being involved in an anti-Semitic incident in the last 12 months. Right? We look at our college students, and something like 4 out of 10 college students have reported not feeling safe on their campus, have reported something being done to Jewish Student Society, the Hillel buildings, whatever, right? Now I will state something very clearly. I believe that the protesters who are out have every right to protest, right? We have free assembly in this country, right? And I value that right. But when you threaten somebody else in terms of going through their daily life, that crosses the line. That crosses the line between the right to publicly gather and threaten and becoming a violent act. Right? The other thing was, I happened to be at a conference earlier this month. The Anti-Defamation League, the big organization in the United States that tries to keep an eye on anti-Semitism, had its national conference. And at the conference, we had the opportunity to sit down with the president of Washington University in St. Louis, as well as, I don't remember where the other guy was from, but it was another fairly large university. And they talked about the protests that occurred on their campuses. What was really interesting to hear was the president of Washington University said 80% of the people who showed up for the protests were not Washington University related people. Right? 80%. So there are people coming in from the outside. Should the students be able to gather? Absolutely. Should they threaten other students? I'm not quite so sure. But when outsiders are coming in, is it still it becomes a little bit more than a university problem. Right? So there's and if I could remember where the other president was from, he backed up the basic statement saying what they're saying is true. Right? One of the other things that if you noticed in some of the encampments, which I thought was interesting, everybody had the same tent. Right? Just a hint that somebody may be funding this. Right? Because somebody got a good deal on a lot of tents. Right? Again, I don't necessarily have problems with the fact that they were gathered. But when it turns out to be that other students are made to feel unsafe on their own campus, yes, I have a problem with that. I remember sitting and gathering on Zoom with some of the students who grew up in my congregation, and they're talking about the fact is that I try to stay as far away from that kind of stuff as possible. But some of them still reported the fact that they're not going to functions where they can clearly be identified as a Jew. Student at Tulane, right, talked about the fact that she was in a Jewish studies class, and it got to the point where class was moved online by the professor because students were so afraid of going to class. Students shouldn't be afraid of going to class. That's just not, maybe I'm naive, but that's not the way I think life should be. If you ask the majority of Americans, 72% will tell you that anti-Semitism is a problem. They may not be able to necessarily define what anti-Semitism is, right? But they'll acknowledge it's a problem, and it's a problem that we as a country need to face. As well as the fact that 90%, 9 in 10, say that it's a problem that affects not just the Jewish community, but our society at large. I've heard a number of people refer to it as the canary in the coal mine, right? Because if we go through history, once one group gets to be picked on, all of a sudden it continues down the line. Now, the largest percentage of these attacks, by the way, are all a result of the October 7th attacks on Israel, right? And you've probably heard this said, October 7th was the deadliest day for Jews outside since the Holocaust. Right? It is as a percentage, as a number, it was incredible. Does it affect people that you know? Yeah, it affects me. I had the opportunity as a high school student to spend some time living in Israel. I went to high school there, and we lived in a community that was about 11 kilometers. You'll excuse me, Israelis think in kilometers, so I never bothered to figure out how many miles away it is. It's 6.6 miles from the Gaza border. We actually, as a group of students, took the bus over to Gaza and were able to spend some time on the beaches in Gaza. Now, I'm talking more years ago than I'd like to admit. It was 1981, right? But the beaches in Gaza were beautiful, right? Was Gaza beautiful? No. But then again, I'm biased. If it's outside New York City, I don't find any city beautiful. I can't help it. But we had the opportunity to do that. Some of the students I knew who were 16-year-old kids in 1981 I spoke to three of them on WhatsApp in the days after the attack. 2 lost grandchildren at the music fest. 1 lost a son in the days that immediately followed. We're not talking about strangers. We're not talking about people you don't know. These were people I went to the beach with, I spent time with. Do I necessarily think Israel is perfect and does everything right? Of course not. Right? But what I am saying is behind all of what we see here, there are real people involved. Right? And I think we lose that sometimes when we start getting all tied up in the numbers. That it happened over there, it doesn't affect us here. That's not really quite the case. Questions at this point, or things that you want to raise at this point? Yes, ma'am.
How would you differentiate between the 2 words, racism and anti-Semitism?
Well, the anti-Semitism, well, I would say, is hatred of the Jews. Hatred of the Jews in whichever way that it gets lived out.
Specifically Jewish, right?
Yes, that's anti-Semitism. It's very specific. Racism and anti-Semitism is a form of racism, but it is its own special category that doesn't always fit into all of the other definitions of racism.
And what makes it special?
What makes it special? I'm not sure that anything makes it special, but I think what it is its prevalence when dealing with the fact that you're dealing with a society or a group of people who are actually such a small percentage of the population, right?
So you're focusing on the size of the group of people who are discriminated against.
No, I am not a fan of discrimination in any way, shape, or form.
And that's why I want to simplify. Why do we have to be specific when racism covers it all? From my point of view, racism is racism.
Racism is racism, but this takes one step further because racism, for the most part, it's often about the kind of the color of your skin, the way you look. One of the things that people often forget is, what does a Jew look like? Right? The reality of the situation is, if you walk through the streets of Israel today, there are Asian Jews, there are black Jews, there are white Jews, there are the traditional Jews that you see on in the theater with the long curls and the big head. But Jews come in all different shapes and sizes and colors and flavors. We are a much broader community than saying, oh, well, you're just a white community. Right? So that's one part of it. The other part of it is and I don't want to play this down, but it can sometimes be a much more hidden one in terms of, for many years I served as a chaplain at the Reading Hospital. I was on call one night, got called to a family's room to do a prayer with a patient who was about ready to be heading into surgery. I showed up, I introduced myself. I'm Brian Michaelson, I'm one of the chaplains here at the hospital. The woman looked at my kippah and says, no, I want a real pastor. Until she knew who I was probably okay, because they said hello, they didn't kick me out of the room, but once I introduced myself, all of a sudden then I was no longer good enough. So I think there are some minor differences that exist between them. but I don't think we should be standing for racism of any sort. But again, I'm talking about the fact is, we're talking about 8,800 in 2023. The vast majority of which, by the way, occurred after October 7th. Right? That's going back and looking at the numbers, which you can do if you go to the Anti-Defamation League site. That's a 10-fold increase over 2014. Right? Tenfold. Right? Our community hasn't gotten that much larger. But a tenfold increase of anti-Semitic attacks, and those are the ones that were reported. Right? So I think, I think it becomes a little special in that way. I'm not asking for special treatment because I believe, and that's actually one of the things that we'll talk about in just a few moments, because I do want to come back to it.
Thank you.
Ma'am?
I was just going to say anti-Semitism is religion.
It is based on religion. Well, people always argue, what are Jews? Right? Are we a religion? Are we an ethnicity? Are we a people? Are we a nation? Are we... And the answer is, we have no idea. Right? The answer is a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Because, yes, we are... It is a faith. But it is a faith that you are born into. Right? Somebody who is born as a Jew never sets foot in a synagogue their entire life and dies and wants a Jewish funeral, has every right to have a Jewish funeral because they were born into it. Right? It doesn't matter whether you were an adherent, whether you were baptized, whether you went through any particular life cycle event. Right? You were born that way. Right? So, kind of a people, but still kind of a religion because we also have ways that people join and leave, right? And so I'm as confused as you are.
I was wondering if you know when the term first was used and why.
That's a good question, and I don't have an easy answer for it. I know that I'm not sure enough of my facts to even go that far.
I'll Google it.
So, yeah, that's probably that's also part of why you notice that we ask the question of something anti-Semitic. It's the question of we're still fighting over the definition of what it is. Right? There are a number of different definitions that are out there of what qualifies as. Just recently, there was a big to-do about one particular international one that some people liked and other people didn't, and it's like, but we have to argue over what definition we like. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
But why has anti-Semitism been around so long? Like you can read it in the Bible. Why?
Why? I wish I had a nice, easy answer. I'm going to answer it in a couple of different ways, and then I'm going to move on because it's important to hear the next part. Jews as a minority, one of the things, I'm going to answer it this way. There's a great children's song that our cantor sometimes teaches our kids. Wherever you go, there's always somebody Jewish. Right? Because the fact of the matter is, Jews have lived in every country around the world as in a presence, sometimes very small, sometimes significantly larger. We've been kicked out of almost a fair number of those countries at one time or another, but Jews were everywhere. So first of all, that was one thing that united people across was You always found them. They were a small minority, never had a great deal of the political power, I'm trying to figure out how to say this without sounding like one of the tropes I'm going to talk about in just a minute, is where was I going? So I think there's also a good deal of the responsibility, to be honest, has to be laid at the feet of the church.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't say that lightly.
Repeat it, please.
A good deal of the responsibility for anti-Semitism lies at the feet of the church.
Any church.
Well, I'm talking about the church in its biggest sense,
Okay.
right? Because you have to remember that for the most part, up until the last 300 years, which by Jewish history is yesterday, there was just the church, right? The biggest shift was between the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox Church. But it wasn't until we got much later that we got Presbyterians and UCC and Lutherans and...
Because we got it right.
And I still ask the question of like, so what's the difference between you and you?
Yeah.
And they look at each other and says, well, we don't know. Because at certain points during history, and let me use this as a way to bridge over to the next, there are 7 traditional, what I refer to as tropes, anti-Semitic tropes, stories that you have heard about the Jewish community. Some of them have a little bit of basis in reality, but have been blown out of proportion significantly. Some of them are these things that have been taught from in homes, and do I understand why? No, because I'm the target. Nobody explains to me why they believe this way, right? I just know what it feels like being on the receiving end, right? My favorite one is that Jews have much too much power. We control the world, right? One of the things that I also do is I'm a police chaplain, right? I spent about 2 weeks ago. I spent half a shift with an officer who was big on conspiracy theories. And without knowing it, he named a couple of, he went back and said the Rothschilds, right, a prominent Jewish family of the day, set up the World Bank and control the financial system and run all of the governments. Our government really doesn't have power. It's the people who behind the money who really have the power. And that's the Jews. He didn't say it in those terms, but by simply referring to the family that he referred to, makes it pretty clear who he's talking about.
George Soros.
George Soros. Well, he's one of the others that also gets mentioned. And my response to that one has always been, and you can tell that for me, humor is one of the ways I deal with some of this stuff. Is that if the Jewish community really was in charge of everything, do you think we would be doing such a terrible job? Second, goes back to the trope I mentioned in the Aldi. Jews are disloyal. They're loyal to each other, but they're not loyal to the country they live. They're loyal to Israel above and beyond. What's happening in your country, right? This is not 50 years ago. This was 9 months ago in Wyomissing, right? We're disloyal. Third, all Jews are greedy. Now there is a history with money and the Jewish community, but let me put it into the right context for you. right? And this is one of those times where I say we have the church to blame for some of this. There is a Jewish law as well as a church law that says lending to members of your fellow religion on interest is sinful. So how many of you are going to give free loans out to people who come to you? I don't see a whole lot of volunteers. But the way it worked was Jews could lend money to Christians on interest, and Christians could lend money to Jews on interest. Right? But when you think about the numbers, you had a whole lot more Christian community that needed loans from the Jewish community than the other way around. So what was known as usury became one of the things that Jews were actually allowed to do. How many of you have read or heard or seen the play The Merchant of Venice? Right? How is the moneylender portrayed? I want my pound of flesh. Right? That's what I'm entitled to. But that's the, here's the interesting thing. When Shakespeare wrote that, the Jews had already been kicked out of England. He was writing it based totally on stereotype. Totally on stereotype. So we could even, and we had more time, we could even make the argument that the Spanish Inquisition was not just a religious awakening in Spain, it was financial. Because Ferdinand and Isabella were in the middle of having a war, were in the middle of wars, right? I think at that point they were fighting England at that particular moment. They owed a great deal of money to the Jewish community because that's who they went to lend the money, because again, who's going to lend the government money without interest? Right? By okaying the Inquisition, they gave the Jews of that community three choices. Convert. Once you converted, you're no longer able to accept interest. Die. Makes it really hard to collect on a loan. Or leave. Again, makes it really hard to collect on a loan. Right? The Inquisition had financial basis to it as well. But as a result of all of these things that have happened, we are the greedy ones. Fourth, the Jews killed Jesus. Right? I have been told that one all my life. Right? What I will tell you, regardless of which gospel you read, right? It was the Romans.
Yes.
Crucifixion was a Roman punishment. Right? The Jewish community may have not objected as heartily as it should have based on which gospel you read. But it was certainly not something that the Jewish community would have said, this is the way we're going to kill somebody. Right? What would they have done? They would have taken him out and stoned him. They would have taken him out and thrown him off a cliff, like the scapegoat, right? They wouldn't have said, "Hey, let's do what the Romans do." Right? And here's just a theological aside for you. Why blame us, even if we were responsible? Why blame us when Jesus needed to die in order to be resurrected, in order to be the sacrifice? Weren't we doing you a favor? Right? Just a...
Yeah.
Also, Jesus wasn't a Christian. Jesus was Jewish.
Of course.
It's not like the Jews came in and killed somebody not their own. I mean, and I know the Jews didn't kill him, but
Right. Well, even if we go back as to Vatican II, which says the Jews of this time didn't kill Jesus, right? Because it was like, I know I wasn't there. Right. Jesus was Jewish. Jesus, as I have always been taught, now I believe, and I will say this clearly, I believe Jesus existed. I believe he lived, he died, he was a fantastic and important teacher. I believe the title that is given to him in the Gospels, Rabbi, which means my teacher, is a correct use of that term and is a good definition of who he was and what he was, right? I don't think he meant to create a new religion. He was reforming the religion he saw at the time and saying, this is not focusing on what it's supposed to be doing. We need to change. Right? He was revolutionary, but he didn't expect himself to be the founder of a new faith, as I believe and understand it.
That's correct.
Right? I think most of what we get is the division comes when we start with Paul, right? And then we move on from there. I think the final, shall we say, nail in the coffin would be the Church Council of Nicaea, 323, 325. When the question is finally decided of is the divinity of Jesus is decided. Because up until that time, there were groups who said, no, Jesus was just a man, no, Jesus was part divine, no, Jesus was fully divine. Right? And they had a meeting and somebody made a decision. Right? That became the kind of final break, although it was 300 years later. Okay? 200 years later. So the Jews killed Jesus. Next are the tropes that we hear: Holocaust denial. Right. Okay, maybe something happened, but it was really only like 5,000 people who were killed. There was no final solution, and all you have to do is search the internet to find Holocaust denial. Right? We still hear stories of it today that people are saying, well, you know, the Jews are always playing the Holocaust card. Right? Tell me how you would feel if 1/3 of your community was wiped out over the course of about 8 years. Right? We went from about 18 million Jews in the world to 12 over the course of that period of time. You know what? It affects us. It happened. It was real. But you hear people say, well, we're constantly using it. It's not really real. It was never that bad. The way I can describe to you the bad is, again, by putting you in touch with somebody I had the privilege to know. How many of you have seen Schindler's List? Okay? If you've seen the movie, you should remember the accordion player who used to play the music while they were working in the factory. The gentleman that character is based on was a member of my first congregation. I spent 6 years serving in Melbourne, Australia, and Lou was a member of that congregation. I remember sitting with him after his brother died, because both he and his brother were on Schindler's List, talking about the fact of that was the first time he told some of these stories, was sitting with me, with his family, getting ready for his brother's funeral. even just sitting there, 40 years later, I wanted to cry. And this wasn't for the pain I felt, but for the pain he felt. Right? It happened. The last and probably one of the most challenging ones is the question of what do we do with hatred of the Jews and the state of Israel? Right? Because oftentimes they're mixed together. Somebody said all of the Jews are in favor of Israel and therefore we hate all of the Jews for whatever is happening. Right? I'm sorry for what's happening in your country. Right? And my response to that was, I vote here. I pay my taxes here. Right? Do I care about what happens there? Sure. I'm also an Australian citizen, by the way. I care about what happens there. Right? At least there I have a vote. But in Israel, I'm just another Jew that they're hoping that maybe we'll send them some money. Right? Do I think about how I give money? Do I think about what goes on there? Of course. Right? Am I happy with what's going on there? No. Right? But I don't think it's as cut and dry as everybody wants to claim that it is. Right? Again, going back to some of the Holocaust denial, people will say, well, the Holocaust wasn't as bad, so the Jews never really needed their own country. Okay. The UN had no right to give that land away. Right, because the European authorities never drew lines in the sand before and created countries out of nothing. If that was the case, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia wouldn't exist. They were lines drawn in the sand, right? And let's be honest, the British, the Dutch, and the British, the Dutch, and the French did a really bad job, right? We've dealt with the Armenian genocide. Well, why did that happen? That's because somebody back in Europe drew lines in the sand and separated the Armenian community into 3 countries: Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. Iran. Which one am I thinking of?
Iraq. I think it's Iraq.
But they got divided up. They became They went from being their own people to being a minority in 3 different countries. Why? Because somebody said, we're drawing a line here and giving you this land to rule. So to sit here and say, government, you can't do that, it's like, are you kidding me? They've done it lots of times. And if you go back to the 1947 partition plan, the partition plan was a 2-state solution. Right? There were 3 territories that were going to become Jewish-controlled, what was going to become the state of Israel, and 3 that were going to be Palestinian-controlled. Right? They divided up where it made sense based on the population. Oops. But we find that it tends to work better for people to kind of tie the 2 together. Jews are responsible for Israel, and therefore, if we hate Israel, we hate Jews. Right? Questions at this point?
I have another
Go ahead.
differentiation question. How do you differentiate between a Jew and a Messianic Jew?
Oh,
A Jew is somebody who is born and born of a Jewish parent, raised in a Jewish parent, raised in a Jewish home, and identifies themselves as a Jew.
Okay.
Messianic Judaism is a whole different animal. right?
I don't know, is it? You tell me.
My answer, without being glib, what is a Messianic Jew? It's a Christian in Jewish clothing.
They're fundamentalist Christians.
Okay,
Right.
so so a Messianic Jew believes that Jesus, as Christians do, is the Messiah.
Correct.
Okay, that's what I want to hear you say as a rabbi.
Oh, well then,
I wanted to make sure I understood it correctly.
yes, and that's why I would say they're Christians. You have to remember that one of the things that people forget is that the organization Jews for Jesus, do you know who originally funded them? The Assemblies of God churches.
Ah,
Right? At one point, the leader of the Assemblies of God churches said, there are 6 million Jews in this country. There are 6 million members of the Assembly of God churches. The duty of every member is to go out and convert a Jew. Jews for Jesus was an attempt to find a Jewishly acceptable way. Right? Now, all Messianic, it's hard to lump them all together because they don't all come from that same background, but from a Jewish perspective, I would not see them as Jewish.
okay.
Right?
They're not Jewish. Messianic Jews are not Jewish. Now, another question. I'm sure you've heard of Mary Ann Williamson. The Jewish author of the book, the first famous book is The Turn to Love. She also ran for president twice.
Okay, vaguely, yes.
So I'm just wondering, do you consider her a Jew? She identifies herself as a Jew.
I think that's a hard question for me to answer because I don't know enough about her.
Okay.
In terms of what her beliefs are, and because having been born Jewish, one can convert out of Judaism, right? People do it. Same as people convert to Judaism, you can convert out of Judaism.
Okay.
The one thing that I've always found interesting is that people converting into Judaism, the largest percentage are Roman Catholic. Jews who convert out from Judaism convert to Roman Catholicism. I have no idea why.
It's the
It's the yarmulke?
yeah.
I always thought it was. In the Jewish community, we have 97 opinions about everything, so nobody's going to tell you you must do it this way. Whereas the Catholic Church is really good at saying this is the only way to do it.
Actually, to be serious, my wife was raised Italian Catholic, and my best friend is Jewish, and he always said that Italian Catholics are the lost tribe of Israel because there are a lot of similarities culturally and in religiously.
In many communities, I'll say it. I don't mean any disrespect to the Orthodox community here, the Orthodox Christian community here, but in many places, the Jewish community and the Orthodox Christian community have one of the closest relationships possible because they are brothers from another mother, right? They are focused on it's loud family gatherings with lots of food, right? Which many of us share, but it's one of those kind of Mediterranean background peoples, right? So, in seminary, I actually worked as a waiter, and I worked at a little Italian restaurant. I was so much a part of the family by the time after 2 years of working there. The first thing you had to do upon arriving at work was go in and give Mama a kiss, right? Because if you didn't give Mama a kiss first, you really heard about it, right? Family are family. Sounds just like my own family, right? The other part of it is, and let's talk a little bit about what might be referred to as anti-Zionism, right? There's a question of where does that begin and end? right? This is where I'm going to be very clear. I'm telling you what I think. Right? I think anti-Zionism borders on anti-Semitism when you make the statement Israel has no right to exist. Right? Because you're saying every other group can have its own homeland, but we can't, because that particular piece of land is too important, too volatile, too whatever. Right? The other part of it is also, I think that's a ridiculous argument for us to be making. Right? Because the question of whether or not Israel should exist is right up there with, should the United States exist? We're here already. Right? You can't sit here and say, okay, we're just going to all give up and become English citizens again, because that would make the world a much better place. Why do we expect the Israelis to do it? Right? Is it perfect? God, no. Am I a huge fan of the current sitting government? Not by a long shot. Right? But let me put it to you this way. For me, I will clearly recognize my love of the state of Israel, while at the same time arguing and struggling with its faults. Right? But the fact of the matter is, it is the one place in the world I get to feel what it's like to be in the majority. Everywhere else in the world, I am reminded regularly that I am a minority. Israel operates on it's a secular calendar, but a Jewish calendar at the same time. You walk through the streets of Jerusalem on Friday afternoon, everything is shutting down for the Sabbath. The same way I do at home. It's the place I get to feel in the majority. Do you really feel the need to take that away from me? I don't know. I think it's a really challenging question. All of this is a really challenging question. And if I had the simple answer, with all due respect to all of you and to me myself, is I probably wouldn't be standing here speaking to you. Right? They'd have me out doing, but it's a tough question. And the one thing I will say is, if you ask most Jews about the Mideast conflict, right, almost everyone will look back at you and say, well, it's complicated. The reason for that is because it really is. Right? We have I'm trying to think about how I want to say this. We have at this point kind of cut our attention spans down to a 30-second Instagram piece. And if what you're told in that 30 seconds becomes your reality. It takes a heck of a lot longer to explain all of this than 30 seconds. And we want to believe something. We tend to want to believe things that are simple. So if we tell you a story of David versus Goliath, everyone's going to root for David, right? If it's going to be the Palestinians versus the Israelis, who's got the tanks? Who have the guns? Well, actually, the guns, both sides. Who's the big guy? Who's the small guy? Who do we want to support? Again, I in no way, shape, or form forgive some of what has happened. I want to make that incredibly clear, right? But at the same time, to sit here and say, well, they deserved it. Did those two granddaughters of my friends deserve to die when going to a music festival? I don't want to believe in a world like that. I should hope that you don't want to either.
Israel is God's chosen people.
Sorry, what?
Israel is God's chosen people.
Choose somebody else. I'm sorry. It's well, because part of me says if this is what it means to be chosen, please choose somebody else. It's
We should root for them. We should be on the side of Israel.
well, I don't believe that it's 100% one way or the other, right? I am very much in the camp that says it's complicated because it's
From Israel, they call people who live in Israel Jews. Why don't they call the people who live in Palestine, why don't they call them Muslims?
well, that's not quite. First of all, 25% of the population of the state of Israel are non-Jews, right? Muslims and Christians and all sorts of Baha'is and all sorts of others, right? So it is a majority Jewish state, but it is 25% of the population is not Jewish, right? The other thing to realize is of that remaining 75%, depending on where you live, a good 40% of the Israeli population is non-religious. The only thing that's happening right now is because the religious community is having so many children, and you will have families with 8, 9, 10, 12 kids, they are the fastest growing section of the Israeli population, right? Whereas most of the secular Israelis, the birth rate is about the same as it is here in the United States. Was it 2.4 kids?
Less than that.
Yeah. So it's going to continue to shift, and that's a problem in and of itself. But I would call them Israelis, right? Do you call them Palestinians? We could have an argument about that because you remember who named Palestine? The Romans, right? As conquerors, they came in and said, we're not going to call this place Judea anymore. We're going to call it Palestine, and that's what they did, right? So Palestine never existed as a state among a self-ruling state by itself, right? That's a false belief, right? But can we? Are there other questions about what?
Well, and just to answer, there are many different religions among Palestinians as well.
Yes.
Right. So it's not that they're all Muslim. It's variety as well. And maybe most of them are, but
the number is a larger majority because the number of Christians, I think it's about 10%. So I think, and then you've got some of the smaller groups like the Druze and the Bedouin and the like. But so it's a much, I don't know, it's 90%, it's 85% instead of 75%. But again, I don't think, but Muslims are a religious people, a religious group, right? They're not a nationalist. From what I understand from my friends who are Muslim, they don't view themselves as there's no Muslim. There are Muslim countries, but there is no, shall we say, country of the Muslim. That's not the way what I meant.
Iran's about as close as you can get, I guess, right?
Right, but even there, you're getting into the question of, okay, are they Sunni, are they Shia, are they, because even within the Muslim community, they don't necessarily get along, right? And this part of the community says, no, you're doing it completely wrong, and we want to get rid of you almost as much as we want to get rid of the Israelis. Yes, sir.
I just,
And it doesn't have to just be on the Israel side.
I'm just curious, is there a term for an act of anti-Semitism against an individual that is not Jewish?
No,
Okay.
but there have been plenty occurrences.
Well, I was born in a Catholic church about half a mile east of here. I was baptized in a German Reformed church. I was confirmed in a UCC church, but I have a Jewish name. And I've been, is that a Jewish name? I've actually been asked if I was Jewish, and there's no doubt that in some class settings or work environment, I was probably biased against because I was assumed to be Jewish.
Well,
It's not just me. I'm sure there's like
No.
thousands or millions out there that the same things. I mean, I grew up in a town that we had minorities 60 years ago, but they were Irish and Italian. So there's always a minority group that someone needs to work on.
Right, and we can still go up through to this day on some of the issues. So the man who was the first Jewish surgeon at Reading Hospital just died about 5 years ago, right? So it's not ancient history. We're not talking ancient history, right? This area is a little unique. It's the Dutchiness of the area, and that because some of the Jewish community came to this community because German was spoken, the Jews who settled here were German Jews. This is one of those places where you can find non-Jewish Schwartzes, non-Jewish Millers, whereas there's actually a famous story. I don't mean that as made up. There is the story of when there was a rash. There was a rash in the 70s of hijackings, airplane hijackings, and one of the planes that was hijacked, the hijackers had collected all of the passports from all the passengers. They were going through them, and there was a woman who was actually born in Berks County, who was a flight attendant. And she was sitting there negotiating with the terrorists, going like, "No, Schwartz is not a Jewish name. I know Schwartzes weren't Jewish, because where I grew up." And the story goes, she probably saved 20 lives by arguing back. But yes, so you do have that occasion. I get the opposite question. It's like, okay, Brian Michaelson, are you sure you're Jewish? Until they look at me. I can't help but I look. So who knows?
One more question.
One more.
You go?
One more question.
Oh, I don't want to be the last one. I'll get.
I thought I saw a hand back there. Over there.
Okay.
Sir.
Well, I stepped out. One thing that concerned me was that you were placed with a random Reading police officer who was ranting about Rothschild conspiracies, and since my tax money goes to Reading police, isn't there a concern about that? Isn't there a screening? Isn't there some sort of psychological profiles? Or did they place him with you so that you could have an influence on him? Or to what extent is the Reading police really out there with the conspiracy theories?
I don't think this is the Reading police. I think this is a particular officer, and I look at my role with the police in a very interesting way. Okay, I do it, and the story about why I do it is kind of interesting because I mentioned that we had three since October 7th. We had 3 bomb attacks, bomb scares, not attacks, God forbid. The lieutenant who was the head of the bomb squad is an officer at Reading. I was chatting with him and said, "Is there anything I can do to help you guys?" He said, "Did you ever think about being a chaplain?" And I kind of looked back at him and said, "Well, if I'm asking you to come out here and do this for me, I better put my money where my mouth is." And so I got involved. I know for sure that they don't scan for political views as part of the hiring process. What I think part of what I can do, part of what my role there is first of all, it's going to sound strange, but it also made me feel good that he was willing to have the conversation with me, right? Because he trusts me, and he trusts me enough to have that conversation without fearing that there's going to be retribution. The other part of it is, as we had the conversation and I could ask questions and challenge some of it, was I may be the first Jew he met that he ever had the chance to have a conversation with. And that
absolutely, all that's really good stuff.
we
It's
begin-
still concerning that there are the possibility that there are more police officers.
Well, I will tell you I am not a police basher, right?
No, I'm
Because
not either.
I do, but I believe that part of what I'm trying to do is change things from the inside out.
No.
And the other part of it is, at least in our country at this point, thank God, political views are not a measure of who should get hired and what's fair hiring and not fair hiring. To some extent, I would be much more concerned if we were living in a situation where somebody couldn't get a job because of their political beliefs. Because if you can do it to one end, you can do it to the other end.
Right. Right, political beliefs are one thing, but believing in conspiracy theories that are harmful.
Yeah. Well, but you know, the question I would also ask is, you know, walk into a Philadelphia police station and walk up to the officers and say, you all need to put masks on because it would make me more comfortable if you were wearing a mask. I don't think you're going to get a particularly warm welcome. I don't disagree in terms of the facts. But the simple fact that he was willing to say, he said that to me gave me the opportunity to start to debunk.
Absolutely.
Right? Would I love to live in a world where everybody liked everybody else? Sure. At the same time, I also know that in some, especially with the cops, you have to prove yourself before they're willing to believe you and talk with you, and you know. So somebody could come in if the deputy chief walked in and said, "We've heard these kinds of stories about they're going to listen very politely and go on with their day, right? Because it's really about what they experience on the front line, and that's my experience with them. Has been, first of all, I wouldn't want their job for all the money in the world. Second of all, I also understand to some extent why they see the world the way they do, somewhat as cynically as they do, because for a lot of that could be an entire separate conversation. And I know we're getting close to time, but I share that not to get anybody in trouble, and I appreciate your discomfort. I do, and know that my reaction was a mix of discomfort and joy at the fact that I had the ability to start to change the conversation. Right? So for me, that means that my presence and the hours that I spend doing this makes it all worthwhile, because it means that hopefully the officers will be better people by the time we get finished.
Yeah, I just wanted to also say that it's one of the things that we don't talk about, but part of our national history is a tremendous level of Nazi sympathizers, right? Wyomissing, where I live, many of the older homes, you couldn't, in the foundational documents, you weren't allowed to sell to Jews.
Or blacks or Catholics.
Or, right. And so, and you know, Thun and Janssen, founders of many of the great institutions, were Nazi sympathizers, and there were Bundhauses all over America, and they were very pro-Hitler until they realized what was going on, and then some of those things changed. But that's part of our awful history that we haven't really addressed, which makes our anti-Semitism very significant.
And it's part of who we are as a country because it's been built in a whole lot of different ways. I don't think it's all nefarious. I just think some of it is just the way the history has played out. I think if you look, we could, as I say, we could go on for a really long time. The one thing I will point out is that some of the debates we are having right now in our country are not new, right? Many of you should know the great Colossus, the poem written by Emma Lazarus it's on the statue. The part of it is on the base of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tire and your poor, right? Do you know what was going on in the world? She did not write that to put it on the base of the Statue of Liberty. It was actually written as a fundraiser to raise money for the base to do it. It was only 17 years after her death that somebody found the poem and said, we should do, happened to be a friend of hers, we should use this poem. Do you know what was going on when she wrote the poem about 20 years before it appeared on the statue? She was a Portuguese Jewish immigrant to the United States, whose family came in the early 1800s. Who came to this country in the early 1800s?
Irish.
Not
the Irish were later.
Not the Irish yet. The Chinese weren't quite yet. They were going to be the next. You had the Western Europeans. It was the Germans, the English, the French, the Dutch, right? Who came over? Let's call it a spade. To get over at that period in time, you had to be rich. Who came over? The wealthy. What happened around the time she wrote the poem? The Chinese Exclusion Act. Right. The very first time our country ever put quotas on somebody's immigration to this country. She wasn't writing about the country that was actually in existence. She was writing about the country that she wished could be. We're having that same conversation. We have that same conversation today. It's just changed the words. It's the same conversation 120 years later, right? Hopefully this time, maybe we'll learn a little bit from what happened before. At least, and if nothing else, you know, I live as an optimist. Thank you so much for spending the evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. We will be convening again on, I believe it's April 22nd, which is the 4th.
No, I think it's the 20. Wait a minute.
You said it was the 29th, am I correct?
Well,
I think it was the 22nd. Yeah, the first Tuesday is the 1st.
right.
So the 22nd will be here, and we have the speaker for next month with us. So I'll ask him, Aiden, if you'd like to say something.
Something. I'll be doing a salute to William James. We may be familiar with his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, put together from his Gifford Lectures in Scotland, I think a bit over 100 years ago. So a lot has happened in our understanding of religious and spiritual lives and experiences in the last 125 years. So I'm going to try to pick up where he left off and bring us up to date. How do we define religion? What are the different ways that people practice it? How do we define spirituality? Why do some people have a conversion experience and other people will never have one, probably? We'll take a look at Orlo Strunk's trademarks of a healthy religion. I'll let you take that home and you can figure that out yourself. We'll take a look at Charles Kirkland's definition of a mature religion. So they're the topics that we'll be taking a look at next month.
Thank you. Many of you are probably wondering about Harry Serio. He hasn't been here for the last couple. He's going to be having surgery very soon. So again, keep him in your prayers. He's quite weak right now, but he hopefully will have that corrected soon. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.